on the last episode of the Cinema Shame podcast.
Well, the one I won't be talking about, and it's good I won't be talking about, is because it was your number one. And I actually watched From Russia with Love.
This is good. I like the way we're working.
And the reason why I won't be talking about it is because I have this thing about the James Bond movies, and that is I only like the silly ones that everyone else hates.
Welcome to the Cinema Shame podcast, sponsored by DVD Netflix. On this episode, James David Patrick and Allan Mott fire up the brand new Cinema Shelfie Wheel of Fate to decide their movie-watching destinies. My name is Rebecca. Even though I don't get to correct Allan's French today, James and Allan kept me around for another week. Where do you think they hide the liquor?
Hello, penitent listeners. I'm James Patrick.
And I'm Allan Mott.
Today we're taking a new theme for a quick spin, quite literally. On the last episode of the Cinema Shame podcast, we decided to let a wheel pick what we were going to first time watch next. The wheel told us the format and the first letter of each title, and we had to find a movie that fit those criteria, the only requirements. We hadn't seen it, and it already lived somewhere in our collection. Some backstory about this one. I just recently renovated my basement earlier this year, and in doing so, I packed up all of my physical media, shoved it in boxes, and hauled it off to a storage unit or the attic. I found titles I didn't even know I owned. I found multiple copies of the same movie, and not just a DVD, Blu-ray, 4K upgrade situation. I'm speaking specifically of the same version of the same DVD and the same Blu-ray. It was a big, what the fuck am I even doing moment. I didn't fancy myself someone that just buys to have the movies. I buy to watch the movies. I do want to make clear. I do intend to watch everything I buy, but the evidence in front of me suggested otherwise. Thus was born the idea for the Cinema Shelfies episodes. So when we spun that wheel, I landed on the DVD shelf with the letter L, and Allan landed on the digital proverbial shelf and the letter W.
I was torn because I had some really highbrow sort of cinematic options. Like, I could have honored Harry Belafonte because I haven't seen The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, and I have that as a digital file on my Plex, so I could have watched that one. But I went in a very different direction because I saw a movie there that I've always been curious about, even though I've never heard. Well, that's not true. I once worked at a restaurant with a chef who was a big vocal fan of this movie, but he's literally the only person I've ever heard say anything positive about this movie. But that was enough to make me go, maybe I should watch The Whoopee Boys.
What sound does the W make?
What?
Let's make the W sound together!
It's their attitude.
Your mama's a blowfish.
It's worldly.
I'm fluent in several languages, honky being one of them.
Spontaneous.
Are these real?
Personal.
Nowadays, it is refreshing to meet a girl with curable diseases.
When you want it all,
Planes, islands, money.
you gotta have the right attitude.
Surprise!
Oh, would you like to disco?
Whoopee Boys.
You need help. You need professional help.
Which is a movie that, when I started it, as I usually do when I start a movie, I just sort of look up the credits to find it out. And in terms of the screenwriters, it actually had a bit of a pedigree. You understand why the script got made, even though it is objectively terrible. And that's because it was written by Steve Zacharias, Jeff Buhai, and Dave Obst, who previously had spun gold with Revenge of the Nerds, which is a very problematic movie watched today, but is actually, a good movie in terms of how it is made and how it connects you with the characters, and how, at the end of this stupid movie, you actually feel good that the nerds have won out. Whereas The Whoopee Boys is the exact opposite, and that is a movie in which you hate every single character. You get angrier and angrier the more you watch it because you're forced to spend time with these awful, awful people. And by the end of it, you wonder how anybody thought any of this could work as an actually good movie. But the thing that surprised me the most was who the director was, because he's not a well-known name. And almost tragically, it's possible that the Whoopee Boys, even though it only made like $400,000 off of its $8 million budget, it probably still, because of just the vagaries of cable and home video, is probably the movie he made that most people have seen, even though before this he was like he's one of those guys where from the 70s like through to the 80s, he kept trying to make a great serious movie, and it just never happened. It just always just sort of, he just couldn't quite get there. His name is John Byrum. He started out in 1975 with a Richard Dreyfuss movie called Inserts, which it had I remember reading about it as a kid and thinking it had a really interesting premise, because it was about a director in the 1930s who didn't like sort of the move from silence to sound, and so he was now basically just working out of his mansion filming porno loops. And it had like a really interesting cast, like with Richard Dreyfuss and Jessica Harper and Veronica Cartwright. But it just, as good as the premise is, it doesn't work as a really good movie.
I think it's an interesting movie. I think it's in what it tries to do and what it wants to be is enough to warrant a recommendation. But I can't say I enjoyed my experience with the film. I really wanted to love it. I was like, this movie has everything it needs to be sort of offbeat but serious and dire, and it has Richard Dreyfuss here, who is really good at walking that sort of, is it funny, is it satire, is it tragedy, and it just falls apart. The premise just doesn't carry it through. And I think you can make the same arguments for Razor's Edge and Heartbeat.
Well, and I was getting to that, like, sort of like, it's sort of like, that was the thing that shocked me the most, was that the movie he made before the Whoopee Boys was Razor's Edge, which is, I don't think it's a successful movie. I mean, there's a reason why sort of it's the one like sort of Bill Murray movie from the 80s that I have literally never heard anybody talk about under any sort of like context. Like, I've heard people talk about Where the Buffalo Roam. I've never heard anybody talk about The Razor's Edge. And so, like, it is sort of, like, funny that he went from, like, this prestige attempt at drama to really one of the very worst slobs versus snobs comedies of the 80s. And that's a pretty low bar not to clear. I mean, there are, like, for people who aren't aware, like, the slobs versus snobs genre is basically best exemplified by Animal House, which is basically, you have, like, our protagonists who are low class sort of losers who, you know, are kind of gross, and they're put up against these, like, snobby, pretentious, rich or upper class things, and we're meant to cheer on the slobs and like and root against the snobs. And that was a big thing in the 80s. Like, that was pretty much a lot of the major comedies followed that format. And again, Revenge of the Nerds is a classic example of a movie that really followed this format. And I got the sense, I had two theories about how this got made. And one was that this was an early script by those guys that they were able to get made because of the success of Revenge of the Nerds. Or it was a case of a film that they thought, well, people really loved Booger in Revenge of the Nerds. So what if we made a movie that was basically one of the main characters is Booger? But the difference is that in Revenge of the Nerds, Booger works because they cast Curtis Armstrong, who, as you know, gross as he is still completely lovable. Whereas in the Whoopee Boys, the Booger character is played by Paul Rodriguez, and he is truly detestable on screen. Like, every time every scene they cut to him saying something rude and nasty to someone, and it's never funny. it's a case where like it's a slobs versus snobs comedy where you end up cheering for the snobs, even though they're awful, because they're less awful than the slobs are. And I think that's a huge miscalculation. You can't do that. So essentially the plot, like, it's one of those films where the plot is just there for the jokes, which is disastrous because none of the jokes work. But we start with Barney, who's Paul Rodriguez, and Jake, who's Michael O'Keefe. And this is the weird thing. It's like, part of me was thinking like, Michael O'Keefe is coming off of Caddyshack, but not really, because Caddyshack really wasn't that big of a theatrical hit. It was only like this movie would have came out just at the point where Caddyshack was starting to hit on home video and becoming popular. So this is actually the great Santini's Michael O'Keefe in this slob versus snobs comedy, and this is going to be his like breakout leading role. And he's like
it's not Nathan Hayes' Michael O'Keefe.
Not Nathan Hayes, yeah. and they have this opening scene where we see them presented as these sort of street hustlers. Rodriguez is doing like a 3-card Monty sort of thing with plastic cups and a ball. We don't actually see how that scam works because the scene ends up before that. And Michael O'Keefe is like an artist selling his paintings on the street. And it's sort of weird because the way that scene is presented, it seems like they're meeting for the first time. But then when they get chased off by the police and we see them running, all of a sudden they're the best buds in the world. And they come up with this plan to get a car and drive to from New York to Los Angeles, like getting paid to transport a car from across the country. And it's like that's sort of the disconnect the screenplay has. It's like we're expected to believe that either like these guys didn't like acknowledge each other at the beginning in this first scene, and they've been best friends all along, or suddenly they know each other for 5 minutes and suddenly they're the best pals in the world. And that's sort of the level of like problem with
game
the screenplay right at the
game.
beginning. Yeah. And so they end up driving to LA, and they end up dropping off the car at this wealthy person's estate where they're celebrating. Where they're having a party because for the anniversary of the death of a dog. And there, Michael O'Keefe sees I want to say I want to say a hot blonde, but like an attractive blonde would be more appropriate. She's sort of one of those cases in one of these movies where you're not sure exactly how the actress got. It's Lucinda Jenny, who I'm sure she's been in a bunch of stuff, and I'm sure but in this it's sort of like as sort of like the dream girl who is supposed to propel the plot in motion. She doesn't quite hit that level. You don't quite understand why Michael O'Keefe is so instantly obsessed with her. And he is, because it turns out that she has inherited this home, that she's turned into this school for disadvantaged children. But there's this weird thing in the will that says that she, in order to get the money she needs to keep it open, she has to be married by a certain time. And her only real prospect for the marriage is this super douchey, like, rich guy. And she doesn't want to marry him. And so Michael O'Keefe basically, like, him and Paul Rodriguez, they basically start working at the school. And and O'Keefe decides, like, well, I'm going to marry you. And she's like, well, no, my uncle, who is the one who has to approve it for the will never approve of you for the marriage. So he goes to this sort of charm school run by Denham Elliott to learn the social graces, to become good enough to marry her. And a bulk of the movie is set at the charm school, and it's sort of like, then it becomes sort of like one of those like movies where it's a bunch of mismatched people at a school, like, police academy, stewardess school. It takes that format too. And in this case, you have Eddie Deason as one of them. You have Marshall Warfield. You have this guy. It's one of those cases where sometimes you see in these movies, you see this character doing a really broad thing, and you think, oh, this was like a stand-up who was hot for like 5 whole minutes, and this was his first movie role, and this was his last movie role for a reason. In that case, it's Andy Bhumatai as Roy Raha Rajmataj, which is one of the more egregious and offensive things in the movie. His portrayal of sort of, I'm not sure if he's supposed to be Indian or Pakistani, but South Asian of some kind, and it's really bad. And there's nothing funny that happens at the charm school, but basically Denham Elliott turns out to be sort of more of a con man than anything else, obviously. And he teaches Michael O'Keefe, like he recognizes a fellow con man in him and teaches him the con man skills he needs to infiltrate high society. And so we next see Michael O'Keefe at a party being run by sort of the judge who is the girl he's chasing sister, and then the rest of the movie is just him trying to get it so he can get the approval of the judge. There is one moment where the movie actually approaches something that could have been funny, and that's where they come up with this really absurd it's called cross court, where they make up, it's basically like a basketball style game that they make up that sort of, I think it's sort of influenced by sort of that Aztec game where you have to like knock the ball in with your elbow sort of thing. Well, in this case, they're using lacrosse clubs, and like sort of the one moment I did laugh was sort of like when they were some of the more absurd rules in this, but otherwise it's just a case where the scenes work like Michael O'Keefe is being Bill Murray, trying to be Bill Murray in a scene, and then you cut to Paul Rodriguez saying something incredibly rude to someone else that we're supposed to think is funny, but instead we just think he's being a jerk. And that's the entire movie, and it's sort of like, I haven't seen The Razor's Edge, but it's sort of like, it made me think like, how could that be a good movie if the guy who made that made this, which is like the movie it kept making me think of was Freddy Got Fingered, which is a movie I know a lot of people love, but I consider it personally to be one of the worst movies I've ever seen in a theater, because I wanted to get the anti-comedy aspect of it, but all I got was the anti part. I didn't get any of the comedy. And that's very similar how I felt about the Whoopee Boys, is that to me it was all anti-comedy and it just didn't land a single laugh.
The Whoopee Boys has an interesting claim to fame. It is one of the flatline movies on Letterboxd, if you know what I'm talking about. The movies where the reviews are spread pretty much evenly from across the board, from 0.5, or you can't do 0.5. You can do 1. So 1 to 5, it's pretty flat. There's like
no, you can do half a star. I've given movies half a star.
I don't know if I've done that yet. Maybe. Well.
Yeah, I would give the Whoopee Boys half a star.
But it's one of those movies that's got I wouldn't say it's a fervent following, but it's out there. And my memory of the Whoopee Boys was late 80s HBO, and I watched it because Denham Elliott was in it. And I think it's possible I may have only seen the second half of the movie. I have no memories of it. I have trace memories of a scene that you mentioned with Denham Elliott, but it is a movie that I have never desired to revisit, and at the time I would have been 8 or 9. So if I didn't find this amusing at 8 or 9, there's really no hope for me now. I don't think, because I'm very very suggestible at 8. Like I would have found just about anything amusing. Not a great selling point for the Whoopee Boys, though. Like you said, if you go looking around hard enough, someone will tell you it is the greatest movie, greatest comedy ever made. I think. Well, I was going to say, I think John Byrum probably had hit a wall by this point in the 80s and was probably just looking for some sort of pop hit, because the things he had done until that point were left of center. There was no real attempt to be a mainstream filmmaker, and unfortunately, I think when you fail multiple times, this is your opportunity to hit the mainstream with Grade Z Bill Murray and Grade Z Booger.
It made me really think of what ended up happening to Noah Black, going from like Pretty Poison and some of the Robert Forster movies he made in the 60s to making Private School for Girls in the 80s, and that sort of that. And that's what in a future episode I'm going to talk about my theory that the IMDb is the most depressing website on the planet. And that was definitely a feeling that I had when I checked out John Byrum's IMDb page and seeing that he had gone from like The Razor's Edge to the Whoopee Boys. It's like sort of like that tells you so much. And even though to me it's inarguably like a half a star movie, like just before what you talked about in terms of Letterboxd, like it's probably the film that he will be remembered for. He won't be remembered for, Insert's Heartbeat or The Razor Edge. He'll be remembered for the Whoopee Boys, and to me that is incredibly tragic.
As I mentioned, I landed on my DVD shelf with the letter L, and Alan Rudolph's Love at Large stared me right in the face. I had to settle for Love at Large. It was the only DVD on my shelf that I hadn't seen. I do have a case filled with burn-on-demand movies that I've collected. I put them all by themselves in little sleeves because I hated the way they looked on the shelf with the uniform blue of the Warner Archive spanning shelves. So they are in a case. They are not in order. I wasn't going to sift through the thing looking for an L movie. So we stopped with Love at Large.
They say you can be trusted.
Who says I can be trusted?
I saw it in a phone book in the train station.
Harry Dobbs just took on a curious case.
Nothing like this has ever happened to me before, Mr. Dobbs.
Harry? Nothing like what?
He has to tail a cheating boyfriend.
I'm feeling frightened and unloved, naked to the world.
But the boyfriend is a husband who's two-timing his wife.
Son of a...
While she's two-timing him.
Don't turn your back on him, Mr. Dobbs.
Harry.
Unless you want a hole in it.
Oh, I like that.
And hot on Harry's trail is a lonely detective without a clue about love.
Maybe we can discuss that book you're reading.
If you were born stupid, you're now having a relapse.
They're all about to learn a valuable lesson.
Oh, that's a relief.
There are no rules with Love at Large.
Thank you, Mr. Dobbs.
Ah, life.
Tom Berenger.
Look, Mr. Dobbs.
Harry.
This is not ethical.
If we were discussing ethics, it'd be pretty silent here.
Elizabeth Perkins.
Maybe we can help each other.
We?
Yeah, you need a dictionary, you and me.
Ann Archer.
Is there a chance for you and me? Would we be glad and dizzy all the time? Or would we destroy each other?
Glad and dizzy. Miss Dolan, get on the train.
Kate Capshaw, Annette O'Toole, and Neil Young.
Who is this guy?
Who's this guy? Good.
In a new film from Alan Rudolph.
Did you hear that?
Only the pounding of my heart.
Love is strange. And about to get stranger. Love at Large.
I'm afraid my story is very complicated, Harry. May I call you Harry?
I like how you look. You got a line up and down. You got another line along the ground. L, 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 you ring my bell.
I'm kind of an Alan Rudolph guy, and I say kind of because I love Choose Me. And Choose Me has caused me to watch a bunch of other Alan Rudolph movies, and I'm still searching for more Choose Me. I really like his aesthetic. It's like cinema self-awareness merging with a slightly unhinged reality. And when it works, it's Choose Me. Heavy-handed dialogue, like raw emotions, people in and out of love, all punctuated by some kind of sexy saxophone track in the background. When it doesn't work, it's also heavy-handed dialogue, raw emotional states, punctuated by a sexy saxophone. So what's the difference between Choose Me and Love at Large? And I guess that's part of the magic of movie making that we can't ever really put our finger on, because these are the same elements in Choose Me that are working in Love at Large. It's the same guy, written and directed by 6 years apart. And both movies are fundamentally about choice. Why do we choose? Who do we choose? What happens when we don't make decisions? So Love at Large is about a schmucky private detective played by Tom Berenger living with a needy, codependent, jealous, insufferable girlfriend who's played by the great character actress Ann Magnuson. And, you know, I've seen her a lot, and I had to go look her up to figure out where I would have known her best from. Like, what's Ann Magnuson's movie? I don't even know if she
Making
has...
Mr. Right.
Well, there you go. That's that is a movie that I've seen with Ann Magnuson.
But that was her big leading,
that was her big leading
lady.
role, right? In all the supporting roles, I was like, she never had more than like 6th billing, and I'm like, that's kind of a shame because she's really good. Anyway, He tries to toss her aside, but she throws some more sexy at him, and he recants. And then as they're trying to get down to the sexy times, he gets a call, and it's a breathy woman asking to meet at the Blue Danube for a chat and possibly a job. And this is lounge singer Ann Archer, who actually has a song on the soundtrack. And she's tapping into a lot of unsmiley, deadpan Elizabeth Scott energy. And it's not really Ann Archer or what you want from Ann Archer. It's awkward.
Which is funny because like she's literally the only thing I remember about this movie because I saw it when it first came out on video.
She's fine, but the Rudolph wants you to compare her to the femme fatales directly. Like there's no beating around the bush here. Like everything he's done to this point is like, this is a noir movie. I made it in the 80s. I want you to think about that. I'm playing the music. They're having this stilted dialogue. She's a sexy dame wearing a little veil. She's coming for a job. She's asking him to follow a specific guy because she doesn't trust him and he's kind of dangerous and she loves him anyway. She literally gives Tom Berenger the description of any dude from Los Angeles. He's 6 foot tall and blonde with angry energy. Like that's as good as it gets. So naturally he follows the wrong guy. It's like you can see this coming. Like, well, we could have done this. The dialogue, maybe the mistaken identity thing could have been a little more clever. So he follows Buffalo Bill, a.k.a. Ted Levine. So he's dancing in a club, nice and tight. He's got a woman. They're kissing. Speaking of kissing, everybody in this movie is kissing. There's like background kissing, foreground kissing, dance floor kissing, like idle street corner kissing. And
there's love at large.
There's love at large, and every time Tom Berenger's like he's like grunting at it. He follows Buffalo Bill home, finds out it's a married couple, suburban, kids, big house. He continues watching, never realizing he's on the wrong guy, until a couple days later when he's leaving for a trip. The wife is crying. She's stomping around the backyard. And he follows him to the airport and gets on a plane. And he turns into Cowboy Buffalo Bill and winds up at a ranch where he has a second family, a second wife, something. Unclear about the exact relationship, but that's Kate Capshaw. So the family guy that you initially thought was a dick because he was the guy that you're supposed to follow, that's the wrong guy, turns out to be a good guy, but then is a dick again. I hope you're keeping up. And then shortly thereafter, once we figure out that he's kind of a dick because he's got the second family, and I think Kate Capshaw is the one who's being wrong. She's got a thing going with the creepy Kevin O'Connor gardener, who's really creepy, and he's Kevin O'Connor, so it's like multiplied creepy.
Yeah.
And then shortly thereafter, just keep piling it on top, Elizabeth Perkins is following Tom Berenger because she was hired by his jealous girlfriend because she thinks Tom Berenger's sleeping around on his jobs. There's just a lot of narrative doubling here. And it gets so redundant because it's like, I get it. I mean, where everyone is cheating on everyone else. Everyone's living two lives. Everyone's got this other thing that they're hiding. And it's, like I said, it's about choice. Who do you choose? And the people in this movie are not choosing. Berenger chooses not to leave the woman he wants to leave because she's super annoying. We learn later that Elizabeth Perkins has an ex-boyfriend who she can't leave. Like, she's just kind of hung up on him and doesn't have any closure. We've got the multiple couples having multiple lives. And I mentioned Ann Archer acting as Elizabeth Scott. Well, Tom Berenger's acting in a movie, acting about being a private detective. The artificial noir is exactly what Rudolph is going for. And while it worked in Choose Me, it's not working here. Part of it's the script, because there's just a lot hanging around that doesn't have any real narrative momentum. But it's also the actors. I like Tom Berenger. I like Tough Guy Tom Berenger. We got Platoon, Shoot to Kill, Sniper. These are all good Tom Berengers. I like Nonsense Tom Berenger. Shattered, I enjoy. Comedy Berenger. Russell's Rhapsody, Major League. I have a problem with...
That's Tom my favorite Berenger.
The Comedy Berenger?
Berenger, yeah.
Even Chasers. I like Chasers.
Yeah.
I'll watch Chasers. I have a problem with self-aware comic tough guy Nonsense Berenger. So, like, he's at, as an example, he's at the first meeting with Anne Archer, and there's a bit of comic relief where he bangs his head on the lamp that's hanging down over the table, the chandelier, whatever's hanging down the table. And it's, we're just reinforcing he's a bit of a schlub. Well, they repeat the same gag when he stands up. And it wasn't really funny the first time. It's not really funny the second time. It's just like a thing that happens in the scene. And he's not very good at his job. And I don't really... His performance doesn't support what's going on. It is the right pitch and the right tone, but I don't care about him as a character. And Anne Archer, who's playing Elizabeth Scott, doesn't really have a role to speak of. She is that archetype, and that is all she is. And she's so hung up on this other guy that Tom Berenger's not even followed, that she doesn't even really have closure. The guy that she actually wants followed is Neil Young.
Yeah.
Yeah. Neil Young.
I just remember that. I just remember that he's in this movie, yeah.
Who's almost unrecognizable at first. Yeah. And it took me just a split second to figure it out. And he's like... It's like Neil Young if he tried to be a yuppie mobster. Yeah. And this is the guy she's hung up on, and he, by movie's end, Berenger punches him out of a window, and he's dangling there by some inexplicable rope, which I can't figure out physically how he's entangled in a rope when he gets punched and rolls down the stairs. It's very strange. But he's hanging out of the window, and he's like emasculated here, and Archer's lying in bed waiting for him to come back and calling his name, like, "Where'd you go? I'm still here." And so it's so hard to pin down why I disliked this movie. I didn't hate it. Again, Rudolph's got this thing going on I can appreciate. And oddly, the only actor that I thought really kind of got this movie was Elizabeth Perkins. And I like Elizabeth Perkins. She's always fine. And here, her underplaying stood out because everyone else was overplaying. Was leaning too hard into the artificial tone of the movie.
I think like my take, because I was like texting you just before we started this, and I talked like how basically I don't like Alan Rudolph. Like I want to like his movies because I get the sense that like there are elements in them that I would appreciate, but just they've never really connected with me. I haven't seen Choose Me. I will give you that. So I'll have to check that one out. But like, I think it's a case where my guess is that the other actors are actually giving Rudolph what he wants. And it's Perkins who is fucking up. But it turns out that what Rudolph wants isn't what's right for the actual movie. And like to me, the evidence of that is Breakfast of Champions, which I consider to be the worst adaptation of a novel of all time. It's a case of someone reading the novel and coming to the exact wrong conclusion about what it's about and how to put it on screen, and then making every single possible mistake in the adaptation. And I think that's the issue, is that sometimes Rudolph's taste and what he's going for just indicates that he doesn't actually understand the subject matter that he's working in. And I think in a case with noir, there's already, with a lot of noir, there already is an element of self-parody and satire. I mean, Double Indemnity is a funny fucking movie. And like Billy Wilder, who, in my opinion, was the best at noir, understood that. That's why Sunset Boulevard is, like, to me, Sunset Boulevard is a comedy, but it is a comedy with hard noir elements. So when you're making a noir, like, especially like in the 80s, you don't need to push it. You don't need to make it overblown. You just have to basically make a noir movie and just be smart enough to acknowledge the absurdity of it, and just have it, like, to me, like what Red Walk Rest is a great example of a movie that like is absurd, but it doesn't push it to the point of like self-consciousness. And I think that's the issue I have with Alan Rudolph. Like the other example of this is Trouble in Mind, which is like the only reason I would rewatch that movie is because it's, one of the only times Divine had a chance to play basically a non-drag role in a film. So for me, for that historical purpose, it's interesting, but it has the exact same problem as Love at Large. It sounds like it, which again, like I can speculate because again, like with the Whoopee boys, I saw it so long ago that I can only I remember thinking that Anne Archer was really sexy, and I remember oh, that's Neil Young, and that's literally all I remember from the movie.
Trouble in Mind I think is better than Love at Large. I think the tone is closer to what it needs to be there. And I think if we're going to hone in on the actors doing what they're supposed to do, I think that if Alan Rudolph has an actor, one that gets everything that he aspires to be, and protects him from his worst tendencies, it's Keith Carradine.
Yeah.
He's the reason Choose Me works so well. And it's also because of Leslie Ann Warren, who's fantastic.
Yeah,
and that movie is a little stagier. It's almost, it's less of a movie production, and it feels more like a stage show. And in that it's confined to one setting for a majority of the film, in this bar. And John Larroquette's a bartender who rides a motorcycle without a helmet. I mean, these are great little bits that are snuck inside Choose Me, and those little bits coupled with Carradine, Leslie Ann Warren really understanding their roles add up to a movie that to me is almost perfect. It is the almost perfect distillation of what Alan Rudolph's whole thing was during this time period. He branched out afterwards and did tonally.
Well, he went the Robert Altman route, because Robert Altman was his sort of protege. And he sort of like Altman, he basically dipped his toe in every genre. And it just proved that, and it's like talking about the IMDb being tragic, is that you look at his movies and you look at his obvious attempts to make a mainstream Hollywood hit, and they were flops. The best he ever did were sort of critical successes, like The Moderns and Alan Parker and the Vicious Mrs. Parker and the Vicious Circle, and Choose Me, and Songwriter. I know had a lot of Roger Ebert really liked Songwriter. So he when he was aiming sort of for critics, he managed to have some success. But when he ever tried to do something that was intended for mainstream audiences, it just never worked.
He did, and The Secret Life of Dennis is the ones that stands out in my mind. I know that movie has kind of disappeared over the last 15 years or whatever, but I really like that movie. It stands out to me as sort of an outlier, because I never put that together with Alan Rudolph until I looked at it a few years ago and saw Alan Rudolph, and that may have been one of the first Rudolph movies I had seen before I got into watching some of his stuff later on. So putting it together with him was a little wild, because none of the Alan Rudolph staples are really in that movie. That is something he clearly made as for critical success, and I thought what he did there was really good.
Yeah.
But yeah, he is a little all over the place, and but when I think about Alan Rudolph, it's Remember My Name, Choose Me, Trouble in Mind, The Moderns, and this one fits somewhere in there as a less successful attempt to do some of the same things. I think he's interesting because of how he operates and what he wants from his actors, and how artificial all of it can be. And
no, he definitely fits my idea of an auteur. If you were to start playing one of his movies that I hadn't seen before, I would be able to identify it as an Alan Rudolph movie.
It's just that,
and I haven't even seen. I've only seen probably a third of his output, and I can still say that.
It's just that he's got such a narrow scope of success for what he's trying to do. It requires such a tight, controlled production where everybody, talking about my favorite Sidney Lumet quote, where everybody needs to be making the same movie. With Alan Rudolph, everyone has a degree of deviation of about 1%. And if you step outside that, you stand out, and the whole tone gets kind of thrown off. And with this one, I feel like the actors were acting in 2 or 3 different movies, and it was too much of the leaning into the artifice of the noir genre. At one point, there's even, Tom Berenger's even watching an old noir on the television. It's like probably a super cheap because I didn't even recognize any actors in it. But just when you think you couldn't hammer it home anymore, here's our private detective laying in a motel room watching a black and white noir with a dame spouting nonsense at a guy, and like it's just too much. One of my favorite moments, however, he's on his stakeout and he's playing like handheld video golf, and he's narrating himself playing it, and the fairway on 8 always proves to be difficult to hit. And I was like, that's funny. I'm glad that's in there because it places you in a specific time and place, and even within we're doing this throwback movie to 40s and 50s, but here's our private detective laying in his car playing handheld video golf on like a little like early Game Boy thing.
Have you ever seen Nightmare Circus? His the horror movie he made with Andrew Prime.
There are quite
it's the one
circus movies. Nightmare Circus. I don't think I've seen Nightmare Circus.
It's
seen
basically
Vampire
like
Circus.
I've only read about it. I haven't actually seen it, but it does sound interesting. But it's the only one he made it under like a pseudonym. So, and for a long time it was sort of like, was this actually an Allan Rudolph movie? And it was only like in the internet age that it actually was confirmed that he did actually make it. But that's always been the only one I've actually been curious about, is because it is supposed to be pretty gonzo, but also you can understand why he has refused to associate himself with it.
Also known as Barn of the Naked Dead.
We're on our way to Las Vegas, and I know I really need a shortcut. Oh, now what?
What the hell do you mean scaring us like that?
I saw your hood up. I thought somebody might be in trouble, so I stopped to help, all right?
Any chance of getting us out of here?
Of course.
Captive young girls chained, abused by a madman is the tagline.
Yeah. And it has something to do with, like, radiation and nuclear war. And
naturally. Yeah, I did not know the existence of that one. I am curious. I mean, he makes me curious, especially if he's doing exploitation. Like, what's that like? Those are kind of my Allan Rudolph and Love at Large thoughts. And I think now the question is for both of us: does it stay on the shelf or does it disappear?
Well, I am a hoarder, so like my Whoopee Boys file only takes up less than a gigabyte on my hard drive, so it'll remain there in case I have to do a podcast and need some like audio clips or something for a truly terrible example of it.
Yes, until the space is needed. I need space on my shelf, so Love at Large is going to cease to live on my L shelf.
Yeah.
All right, let's do our spinning for our next episode of the Cinema Shelfie. First up, Allan is going to be watching. You're still on digital, and you're stuck in the letter S.
So I have a lot of S's.
Which should provide a bevy of opportunities.
Let's see, I can... How many options I have? I have 296 movies in my S file. I don't know how many of them are ones I haven't watched, but I still think that's pretty... Oh, I'm excited because I recently downloaded Savage with an exclamation point, which is a Filipino-made Roger Corman blaxploitation film that was considered lost for a really long time, but just recently showed up on Tubi, and I own the soundtrack, which I bought when I was in England. So that might be my choice for that one, or it could be something completely different.
That's the great thing. You just never know.
Yeah.
All right. I am still in DVD, and I'm doing the letter T. T. All right. We have our assignments.
So I'll be able to say, what's the T in the next episode?
Yeah. You can, as much as you want to. That won't get old.
what everyone is reaching for the top. This is a place where rewatch will never do. Well, it's okay to want all the hits, but once you step across that debts, no matter where you have the birds come on after you. Lord, it's a shame down, blame down, take down.
The Cinema Shame podcast is brought to you by DVD Netflix, because yes, you can still get DVDs delivered right to your mailbox, at least until September of 2023. Sign up for a subscription today at dvd.netflix.com. Our theme song was written and recorded by Preacher Boy. Hear more from the godfather of the alt blues at preacherboy.com. You can find us on Twitter at Cinema Shame and on Instagram at Cinema Shame Podcast. Cinema Shame lives on the web at cinemashame.wordpress.com. If you have a confession you'd like to make on Cinema Shame, email us at cinemashame@gmail.com or send us a message on Twitter. That's all for today's episode.
Had hit the hood of Eastwood, that well-known meanie who, like Bellini, thought absurd. Soderbergh's claim that famous Harold Ramis was the greatest director in the history of cinema.
You have chosen wisely.